A call in the dark. My family and I have always lived in Georgia, a quiet place where the air feels heavy with untold stories. It's a region full of sprawling fields, dense woods, and small towns with their own peculiar secrets. My cousin Bob was one of those people who had seen the hidden side of this sleepy area. As a police officer for 5 years, he dealt with everything from petty theft to violent crime. But there was one night, one call that changed him forever. It was late in the summer, the kind of humid night where the air clings to your skin, and even the cicadas seem restless. The station received a call from an address halfway between Macon and Roberta. The caller sounded frantic and incoherent. He kept repeating, "I can't handle this anymore. It's all too awful." When Bob and his partner arrived at the scene, the house looked abandoned. The lawn was overgrown, the windows grimy, and the paint peeling in long, jagged strips. But sitting on the front steps was an elderly man. His shoulders were hunched, and his head hung low as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. As Bob approached, the man began to sob. It wasn't the quiet weeping of someone grieving. It was the guttural, choking sound of pure despair. Between sobs, he muttered, "They're gone. All of them. Gone." How could this happen? Bob tried to ask what was wrong, but the man was too distraught to give a coherent answer. Bob's partner called for backup, while Bob decided to check the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. A house of decay. The moment Bob opened the front door, he was hit with a stench so vile it made his eyes water. It was the smell of rot, decay, and filth. He gagged and pulled his shirt over his nose, stepping cautiously into the dimly lit living room. The floor was littered with trash old takeout containers, empty soda cans, and crumpled cigarette packs. The walls were streaked with grime, and the furniture was overturned and covered in stains. "Police!" Bob called out, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the house. He moved through the living room and into the kitchen, his boots crunching over broken glass and discarded wrappers. The kitchen was even worse. The counters were piled high with dirty dishes, some coated with mold. Flies buzzed around a forgotten plate of food that had been left out so long it was unrecognizable. The discovery, Bob made his way down a narrow hallway, where the smell grew even stronger. It was a mix of spoiled food and something much worse, something sickly sweet and metallic. He stopped outside a closed door at the end of the hall. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open to reveal a bedroom that was the epicenter of the horror. On the bed lay two corpses, their skin a sickly gray-green, and their bodies bloated from decomposition. The man and woman were intertwined, as if clinging to each other in their final moments. Their faces were partially decayed, their eyes sunken and lifeless. Bob's stomach churned. But what caught his attention and nearly made him collapse was what the woman was holding. Clutched tightly in her arms was a tiny, lifeless infant. The baby's skin was pale and waxy, its eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. But peace was far from the truth. As Bob stood frozen in horror, he saw something move. A cockroach crawled out of the infant's mouth, scuttling across its tiny lips before disappearing into the folds of the blanket. Bob staggered backward, his vision swimming. He stumbled out of the room, barely making it to the front steps before he doubled over and vomited. The elderly man was still sitting there, staring blankly ahead. He didn't even react to Bob's retching. When backup arrived, they secured the scene and began piecing together what had happened. The elderly man, it turned out, was a former co-worker of the deceased couple. He had come to check on them after weeks of no contact. What he found inside the house shattered him. A tragic story. The couple had been struggling for years. After the wife suffered a back injury, she was prescribed opioids for pain management. The husband, who had always been supportive, began taking them as well to deal with his own stress. Over time, what started as medication turned into addiction. They lost their jobs, their friends, and their sense of reality. Their home became a prison of their own making. The baby, born into this nightmare, was neglected, malnourished, and frail. The child didn't survive the harsh conditions. When the couple found the baby dead one morning, it broke them. In their grief and addiction, they made a pact to end their lives together. They injected themselves with lethal doses of heroin and lay down on the bed, holding their child for the last time. Bob later learned these details from the coroner's report, but the knowledge didn't bring him peace. The image of that tiny, lifeless baby and the cockroach crawling from its mouth haunted him. It was a scene he could never unsee, a memory that would stay with him forever. The silent intruder. A few months later, Bob responded to another call that left him shaken. This time, it was a potential break-in at a woman's house. She lived alone and had reported hearing footsteps downstairs after discovering a broken window. But before Bob could get more information, the call abruptly disconnected. When Bob arrived, the house was dark and eerily quiet. He knocked on the front door, announcing himself, but there was no response. He circled the house, flashlight in hand, and found the broken window. It was shattered inward, glass scattered across the kitchen floor. Climbing through the window, Bob drew his weapon and called out, "Police! Is anyone here?" The only reply was the creak of the house settling. His senses were on high alert as he moved through the kitchen and into the living room. Everything seemed untouched, no signs of a struggle, no obvious intruder. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. At the top of the stairs, he called out again, "Ma'am, it's the police. Are you okay?" This time, a faint voice replied, "Yes, I'm in the bedroom." Bob followed the voice to a closed door. He opened it to find a woman sitting on the bed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. Bob asked her what had happened, but her answers were vague. She kept glancing at something behind him, her expression a mix of terror and pleading. Bob turned his head slightly, catching sight of the closet in the reflection of a mirror. It was open just a crack, and he could see a shadowy figure crouched inside. Acting quickly, Bob said, "Ma'am, I need you to step outside with me to sign some paperwork." The woman hesitated, but Bob gave her a reassuring nod. As soon as she was out of the room, Bob turned back to the closet, gun drawn. "Come out slowly," he commanded. The closet door creaked open, and a man dressed in black emerged, his hands raised. A glint of metal caught Bob's eye as the man dropped a knife to the floor. Bob restrained the intruder, calling for backup. It turned out the man had been hiding in the house for hours, waiting for the right moment to attack. The woman had pretended everything was fine, hoping the intruder wouldn't realize she had called for help. The aftermath, Bob saved that woman's life that night, but he was never the same. Between the horrors he witnessed in the decaying house and the chilling encounter with the silent intruder, he began to see the world differently. His once idealistic view of law enforcement had been replaced by a deep understanding of human suffering and the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary places. Even now, years later, Bob can't shake the memories. The smell of rot, the sight of lifeless eyes, and the feeling of someone watching him from the shadows, they're all burned into his mind. And in his quietest moments, when the world is still and the darkness settles in, he hears the faint, ghostly cry of a baby that will never rest. My family and I have always lived in Georgia, a quiet place where life feels simple and predictable. The kind of place where small town charm mixes with the slow rhythm of rural life. Stories of real terror rarely emerge from our little corner of the world, which is why the one I'm about to share is so haunting. It didn't just disrupt our peace, it left a permanent mark on my cousin, Bob, and changed him forever. Bob had always wanted to make a difference. Joining the police force was his way of giving back to the community he loved so much. A police officer for 5 years, he'd built a reputation as someone dependable, kind, and empathetic, a man who treated every call with the seriousness it deserved. But one summer evening, a routine dispatch would lead him into a nightmare he could never have imagined. It started with a call from a distressed man. The caller's voice trembled as he told the dispatcher about a horrific discovery he'd made at the home of an old acquaintance. His words were disjointed, his tone panicked, and all he managed to convey was that something terrible had happened. He insisted the police come immediately. The house in question was in a rural area between Macon and Roberta, a stretch of road flanked by dense woods and open fields. When Bob and his partner arrived at the scene, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the driveway. The caller, an older man in his 60s, sat on the front steps of the house, his face ashen and his hands trembling. He barely acknowledged their arrival, muttering under his breath, "It's awful, so awful." Bob crouched in front of the man, trying to calm him down and piece together what he'd seen. But the man's gaze was distant, and he repeated the same phrase over and over. Realizing he wasn't going to get more information from him, Bob nodded to his partner, who stayed to comfort the man while Bob approached the house. The house was uninviting, even in the fading daylight. Peeling paint and boarded-up windows told a story of neglect, and the overgrown yard suggested no one had cared for the property in years. Yet, a faint light glimmered through the curtains, a small but undeniable sign of occupancy. Bob's first step inside was met with a sour, putrid odor that hit him like a physical blow. He gagged, but pressed on, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. The living room was a chaotic mess. Piles of trash, dirty dishes, and old newspapers filled every available surface. A layer of dust and grime covered everything, evidence of long-term neglect. He called out, his voice steady but loud. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" The silence that followed was unnerving. Only the distant hum of cicadas outside broke the stillness. Guided by the smell, Bob moved cautiously through the house. The hallway was narrow, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper that seemed to close in on him with every step. The closer he got to the source of the odor, the heavier the air became, like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. At the end of the hallway, was a closed door. The smell was overwhelming now, and Bob's stomach churned. His hand hesitated on the doorknob as his mind raced through the possibilities. Finally, he steadied himself, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The scene inside the room was something out of a nightmare. In the center of the dimly lit space was a bed, and on it lay two lifeless bodies. Their pale, waxy skin glistened with a sheen of decay, and the sound of buzzing flies filled the air. Bob's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his training forced him to stay. He stepped closer, trying to make sense of the grim tableau. It was then that he noticed something else, a smaller figure nestled between the two adults on the bed. A child. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The sight of the tiny, lifeless body among the others was more than he could bear. He stumbled backward, his stomach lurching. The oppressive smell, the horrifying sight, it was all too much. Bob turned and bolted out of the room, his boots pounding against the hardwood floor. He barely made it to the front yard before he collapsed onto his knees and vomited into the grass. His partner rushed over, alarmed by Bob's ashen face and trembling hands. "What happened in there?" his partner asked, gripping Bob's shoulder. Bob struggled to find his voice. "Call for backup," he finally managed, his voice cracking. "And the coroner. We've got multiple deceased." He couldn't bring himself to elaborate. When additional officers and investigators arrived, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. The elderly man on the steps was a former coworker of one of the deceased. Concerned after not hearing from his friend for over a week, he decided to check on the family. What he found had left him traumatized. Inside the house, investigators uncovered clues to a heartbreaking story. The family had been battling severe hardships, financial strain, chronic illness, and mental health struggles. Medical records indicated a reliance on prescription medication, and evidence in the home suggested that the family had become increasingly isolated. It appeared they had succumbed to their circumstances, slipping into a tragic spiral of despair. The discovery of a note in the bedroom confirmed their suspicions. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, the message revealed a desperate attempt to keep the family together in the face of insurmountable odds. The note spoke of love, pain, and the unbearable weight of their struggles. The incident left a deep scar on Bob. As a police officer, he'd seen his fair share of difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. The images from that night haunted him, invading his dreams and creeping into his thoughts during the day. For weeks, he struggled to focus at work, his usual confidence replaced by a lingering sense of unease. Eventually, Bob recognized that he couldn't carry the burden alone. He sought counseling through the department, where he found a safe space to unpack his emotions and begin the slow process of healing. The sessions helped, but the memory of that night never fully faded. Every time Bob drove past the stretch of road near the house, he felt a pang of sadness. It was a reminder that even in a quiet, close-knit community, struggles can remain hidden behind closed doors. The experience changed him, reshaping the way he approached his job and the people he served. He became more attuned to the subtle signs of distress, more determined to connect with those who might be suffering in silence. Years later, Bob still talks about that night, though rarely in detail. He tells me it taught him the importance of compassion and vigilance, of looking beyond the surface to see the struggles others might be hiding. You never really know what's going on in someone's life, he says. Sometimes the quietest places hold the darkest stories. For our family, Bob's experience is a sobering reminder of life's fragility and the hidden battles that many endure. It's a story that has stayed with us, not just because of its horror, but because of the lessons it taught us about empathy, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to confront life's darkest moments.